we know where the teams stand now, and it's going to be pretty interesting. And starting with one of the bigger teams in these conversations, the New York Knicks. Like I said, they come off of a massive loss against the Cleveland Cavaliers, and then they follow that up with another brutal game against the Boston Celtics. So the question really starts: is New York actually? Do they have any chance of contending? Riv, let's start with you.
They're in a brutal spot right now, and I say that because all confidence is shot right now. They have to find it within themselves to get that ability to kind of perform right now. You've lost 2 games against Cleveland. The first game earlier in the year, it was a really good game actually. That game was really came down to the wire, and then of course Darius Garland came to bless, and he was really clutch for them late in that game. You go up against Boston 3 times, and I think you've had the lead. I saw this stat. You've had the lead for a combined 50 seconds in all 3 games combined. That is truly a statistic I haven't heard in some time now, probably never in my life. Excuse me, but that is a statistic nonetheless. Then you head up against Cleveland one more time, and you feel like the energy should change, the energy should shift. And they beat you by 40 points in Cleveland. I mean, it was an ass whooping. Cleveland was able to do whatever they want in the pick and roll. And Darius Garland didn't even play that well. That was one of his few bad games. And they still, DeAndre Hunter, Max Strus, I mean, Ty Jerome, this team from top to bottom, the continuity, the depth that they have were able to just exploit and hound the New York Knicks. And then, of course, Evan Mobley was amazing. Now you had the Boston, which is a Sunday showcase, primetime game. Everybody's watching, and you lay another dud. I think the problems with New York stem from, of course, the obvious answers of Cat playing the 5 and defensively them not being as locked in as you want them to be on the perimeter, them constantly switching, them getting beat off the dribble, and pretty terrible rotations. And yeah, I look at it and like I'm looking at Cat. Cat's obviously a problem. But at the same time, like these guys easily give up on the perimeter with just letting them switch. There is no, multiple doubles. I don't see guys fighting over screens. We saw OG a little bit fighting over those screens, getting down and grinding dirty. But this defensive team, Tom Thibodeau is elite at his defensive schemes. He has been one of the better defensive coaches in our time in the basketball association. And this year, they just haven't been that. And I know this New York team, this fandom is preying on Mitch Robinson to come back, but he's not God. He's not this working miracle. This man has not played over 50 games in 2 seasons. I think John threw me the stat. I forgot the exact number. I'm
He's
sure
played 31 games the last 2 years.
Here we go. John, I thank you. Love you to death. He's played 31 games in the past 2 seasons. That's not somebody you can just wake up and think he's going to be here or be healthy. You have to kind of understand that he might not be available for you guys. So now you have to look within the margins. You have to start looking at other options. And New York is in this tough position because Cleveland and Boston look like the cream of the crop in the East right now. They're both sitting pretty at 40-plus wins, the number 1 and the number 2 seeds comfortably. And they've been dominant all year. Cleveland, more or less, has been dominant all year, every week. Boston's had his hiccups, but for the most part, it's been there. New York, your record against 500 teams in general isn't the best. And on top of that, against the top 2 teams in the East, you haven't won a game yet. I fear for this team because defensively, teams like Indiana can give you some fits on offense. Teams like Milwaukee can give you some fits. You're not a shoo-in to just dominate Detroit. I think you win that series, but that could be a drug-it-out, dragged-on series. And now you're looking at a second-round matchup potentially against Boston in which you have no chance of winning. I do give Brunson some grace. I think he's an elite player. I think he's a guy that can tilt a playoff series, but that's a tough matchup. And I think for all intents purposes, New York is sitting in a pretty tough position where in the same week you've got blitzed by Cleveland and Boston, and there is no reinforcements that's coming for this team.
Listen, the New York Knicks spent 5 first-round picks this summer and mortgaged half their identity and half of their young core to compete with the Boston Celtics. And to be a top-end contender that could go to the finals, not just a team that is making the playoffs and winning a playoff series, a team that could bring a championship and really restore that gravitas in New York City. Despite adding Karl-Anthony Towns, Mikal Bridges, and OG Anunoby, this year they're 0-7 versus the Oklahoma City Thunder, the Celtics, and the Cavaliers. And it's not just the fact they're losing all of these games, it's how uncompetitive each and every single one of them have been. And the 3 games they played versus Celtics, they lost by 23. They lost by 27, despite them not having Kristaps and Drew Holiday in the second matchup. And today they found themselves down by 20 points by the second quarter. And despite a late third quarter surge by Cat and Brunson, Tibbs sits JB to start the fourth quarter, and the Knicks end up losing by 15 again today as well. There are 11 and 14 versus teams above 500. And we have never seen a healthy Tom Thibodeau team in the playoffs. In 2021, Mitchell Robinson did not play. 2023, Julius Randle was out. Last year, half the lineup was injured. And now I wouldn't blame the majority of those injuries on Tibbs for overrunning his players and playing them too much. But even a guy like Josh Hart, who did get hurt, is something where I look at Tibbs playing him more than almost any other player in the NBA. And with how hard some of these guys play, it's clear that the Knicks don't have a championship formula. But on top of that, this team doesn't have any margin for error. If one of Brunson or Cat, of course, get hurt, but even Josh Hart, this team can get knocked out in the first round if they play a team like the Bucks. And we've talked about the Knicks for a long time because they have an elite offense. Brunson's an unguardable playoff performer, but everything else here is falling apart like a stack. It's a stack of cards that doesn't translate well to the postseason. Karl-Anthony Towns is meant to be a 4 in the playoffs. We saw that last year. And if Mitchell Robinson has been out the entirety of the last calendar year, you look at Cat having to be a full-time rim protector where he often gets put into foul trouble. And in games like today, Cat cannot get any offense going when you have a small like Drew Holiday matched up on him and really sizing him up in the post and completely stifling him. And I look at this team's bench. Today they're running Landry Shamet because they're still down guys. They don't have rim protection. The perimeter defense is good, but we're seeing clearly they don't have enough on that end of the floor because they're a bottom 10 defense right now. And along with the inconsistency, along with their stars not showing up in these high-stakes games, I'm not convinced Tom Thibodeau is the coach that's going to deliver the Knicks a championship anytime soon because this is the same coach who's been set in his ways for a long time. And I don't think he has ever really had the playoffs as his focus. He's always been a high-level floor raiser in the regular season, and that's often come back to bite the Knicks. So when we talk about this team, they're a major disappointment because they've turned around so drastically the last 3 years, and they've added so much, and they've made so many big moves, and yet they're a worse team than they were last year.
There's a lot to get into. And I think the first way I want to pursue this conversation, John, you made a point about Tom Thibodeau being stuck in his ways. I think we saw that with around 4 minutes left in the game. Karl-Anthony Towns drives to the rim, starting to limp, and he starts to kind of lay on the bench and go to the locker room. And obviously with Karl-Anthony Towns, there's always a fear of a major lower body injury with him. And then 2 minutes later, after that relatively dramatic scene of events, he comes back on the floor and he's still limping on the court. And the game was an 18-point game at that point. It was over, yet you have your star with a ton of mileage, with a lower body injury history, who just got hurt on the floor, clearly displaying his injury. That's a big problem with the Knicks. And I think that was really important to highlight because I want to transition just back to the entire scheme of the team. And I'm not disappointed because we should have seen this coming with the New York Knicks. This New York Knicks team is the definition of a tier 2 basketball team. They can dominate any of the first 25 teams in the NBA, but then once you get to the top 3-4 teams in the NBA and you're playing the Thunder, the Cavs, etc., the Celtics, those teams can match up with you and actually be better than you in terms of front court length, size, versatility, and overall defensive discipline. And if anybody's watched Karl-Anthony Towns for 10 years, ding, 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 I know Karl-Anthony Towns like a book. He is an incredible offensive player in 90% of matchups. You see a Nikola Vucevic. He's going to drop 34 and 18. Not quick enough for Cat, and he's not, right? He can't stay in front of him and Cat's floor spacing. But then you play a team like the Celtics, Karl-Anthony Towns. He can be matched with length, with strength, and it throws him off. It's always throwing him off. And the Knicks went all in the last 2 years on Mikal Bridges, Karl-Anthony Towns. It was just a very bad management of assets. And now this team is forever going to be limited because their two best players are the limited ones. Jalen Brunson, as dynamic as he is, He's always just going to be a decently athletic 6'2" guy. That's never changing. He's never going to have elite length. Karl Anthony Towns is probably always going to have issues with the Cavs, with the Celtics, just with the way he plays the NBA game. He struggles when he can't use his quickness as a strength, and when he has to adapt, he gets erratic. And that's talking about offense. That's not even talking about defense, where the Knicks are 24th in the NBA. Mikal Bridges doesn't look great. Karl Anthony Towns, we know his limitations there, and those type of teams can exploit them. When your two best players are exploitable on defense and they have clear physical limitations, you're not going to win a championship that way. And when your role players can't defend and make up for those weaknesses, which Mikal Bridges hasn't done at all this year, this is who they are. They're a good team that's going to dominate the first 23, 24 teams in the NBA. That's why they're the third seed, but they're going to lose to the truly elite teams. They're the definition of a tier 2 team.
Yeah, I mean, you said a lot of good things. And even going prior to Minnesota, Tom Thibodeau's in Chicago. I mean, he was running Luol Deng to the ground. This dude was leading the league in minutes. He had Derrick Rose in a game where they were up 14 with 3 minutes left in the playoff game. He shouldn't have been in. I mean, this is what he does. This is his philosophy. He trusts the guys he trusts is who the guys he's going to play. And he has a very tough leash. And he's the guy who, if you make one mistake, he pulls you. He pulls you. He's not a guy who's, if you have to gain a lot of trust with Thibodeau. And that's not to say he's not a bad coach. He's just a stubborn one. And I do think New York sending 5 first-round picks from Mikal, I think that was a tough pill. Giving OG a shit ton of money, and he's still, he's also a guy with injury history. That was a tough pill. Trading for Cat, I think it's not a terrible idea, but you don't have the proper guy next to him to kind of maximize him, because I think that guy was Rudy Gobert, who at the 5 can do what he does, and Cat can play the 4. Offensively, what Cat has brought to this team, you love everything about it because he is maximizing his offensive prowess. And this offense in New York has been an elite offense all year. Mm-hmm. But when you play an elite team like Boston, who defensively knows what they want to do, defensively can give you fits, this is the type of things that happen. When you play an elite defense like Cleveland, this is what they do. They box you up, and now you're in games where you're not even close. So I think New York, the goal was to go all in. The goal was to be competitive, and you have some soul searching this year, and you need a run in this playoffs because you're going to be with these 4 to 5 guys for the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's kind of the heartbreaking thing if you're a Knicks fan, because this is the best team that they've had in our lifetimes, and yet they're not even close. You can say, well, they're young, they're developing, maybe they need to gain some more chemistry. And yeah, but at the end of the day, when you invest all that you did in Mikal Bridges and you get this output in games like tonight, you realize that the theory of Mikal has always been better than the reality. And this high-level scoring option and super versatile defensive player of the year caliber wing, you're not going to get those two things combined on a night-to-night basis. And I think you put it best, James. Their 2 best players are extremely gifted. You won't find me saying a negative thing about Jalen Brunson because I believe he's a top 10 player in the world. And Karl Anthony Towns, in any given matchup, can give you 50 and 15 rebounds, and he's the best 3-point shooting big we've ever seen. But even with those innate strengths that they have, they come with really unique, and I wouldn't really put this on JB defensively. I mean, today he was guarding Porzingis and holding his own on face-ups, which is insane. Porzingis is a full foot taller than him.
And a half.
But in Cat's case, it really shows the impact of having that high-level rim protector. That's why I'm a humongous Bam Adebayo or a Draymond Green fan, because those are the guys who give you that foundation for a star like Brunson to bring you to a NBA Finals appearance. But with those really unique weaknesses Cat has, he's best as a 4, and that's where he's going to be held back because you want him going up against 5s on the offensive end, and then you want him playing on against 4s on the defensive end. And finding the best of those both worlds is really hard to come by when you basically chose to have Mitchell Robinson over Isaiah Hartenstein. This is a team that signed Hart 2 years ago, and his limited playing time, he was the better player, and he was younger, and he was a lot more reliable. And by the Knicks not being proactive in moving Mitchell Robinson sooner, I mean, he's played 60 games one season since 2020. They lost that one stalwart on the defensive end. And he gets paid a ton of money, almost $30 million a year, $30 million in fact by Oklahoma City, and it's been worth it because he's the one who adds that extra layer. So it's really disappointing, I think, if you're a Knicks fan. You can find a silver lining that we're going to be good, but if you held on to those assets a little bit longer and waited for a better move, and I'm really talking about Mikal, number one, and then a little bit of Cat as well, but I'm not going to be as critical. I mean, you moved Julius Randle and Dante. I think they lost a little bit of the chemistry there with those two guys, but I would have made the Cat move. The Mikal Bridges trade to me is one that I was intrigued by. I'm like, this is pretty cool at the time. But when you sit back and look at it from a really a further point of view, you realize it's one of the worst trades in recent NBA history because that was their version of all in move, and it made the team worse.
The problem with the Karl Anthony Towns trade wasn't the Cat trade on the surface. It was comparing what they had like 14 months ago to what they had today. They had, 8-9 first-round picks to trade. RJ Barrett, Emmanuel Quickley, Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo. All of these assets they can flip. And it turns into OG Anunoby, Mikal Bridges, and Karl Anthony Towns. All of them are very good players in their own way. But when you have those type of assets, you get those assets, so it's, okay, let's win a title. Let's go all in for a title. And the problem with that those set of trades was, is this getting the job done? No one's denying it's going to be a good team, but the management of assets was just completely off. The Knicks lucked in to Julius Randle in free agency, Jalen Brunson in free agency. Those are free assets that they were able to build around and get all of those assets. Mm-hmm. And then they convert all of that luck into a really good team that's not great. And because they're two stars, while they're super good and there's very few players with a significant flaw, now you have two stars who can get targeted on one side of it. And on the other end of it, the supporting cast that you overpaid for financially and draft capital-wise, it's not enough. And then you let a top 12 center in the league go because you trust the guy who's hurt all the time. Yeah, I get the CBA stuff and how much Hartenstein got signed for, but it was just bad management or asset management. You can't put it any other way.
Remember in the CBA messed them up because they couldn't sign Hartenstein for what OKC was going to give them, which was unfair, obviously, but it really put them in a tough position. And Hartenstein talked about it. He was like, he would have stayed, but that money OKC gave him, man. Yeah, that was game changing. And I was like, damn, like only a few teams could give him that bread. It was unfortunate because Isaiah Hartenstein really embodied New York and he really wanted to stay. Yeah. But that money, you can't give that money up.
But then the Robinson money and then the OG Anunoby money, I mean, that's where it kind of gets crazy, right? You trade RJ and Emmanuel Quickley, who are honestly like two really good complementary young players, for OG, which by itself isn't great asset management because I think OG's better than both of them, but not better than both of them combined, in my opinion. And then the draft, and then you give him that money, and then you already, like, it just didn't feel like good asset management once again. Maybe you can get off of Mitchell Robinson somehow to bring back Hartenstein. Not sure how the cap space works in that scenario, but there's just a lot of layers to what just doesn't feel like enough. Just feels like it's really good, but not great. Kind of like those Pacers teams in the 90s. You're really good, but you're really good. That's all I can give you.
Hey, they made a finals eventually.
That's true.
I will say on the OG front, they consolidated off iHeart because they didn't want to pay him to be the sixth man behind Brunson. I felt that was good asset management, but because of how versatile and how like helpful a player OG Anunoby is, you had to pay him that going rate for high level two-way wins. That's $40+ million for a guy like him. So I don't think it was bad asset management as much as it was you do have to overpay to keep a guy like him.
I don't think nobody was giving him $40 million on the market.
$40 million is crazy for OG still. I don't care.
You don't think Detroit would have given him $40 million? They give Tobias Harris $25.
That's why you don't trade RJ and IQ for a guy on a one-year deal.
John, that's a fair point because Detroit does do some wild shit. So I you know what?
Fair. You don't think Charlotte would have offered him 35?
Maybe
not 40.
Charlotte, that trade was an overpay.
Let me rephrase. I don't think a competent organization
off the Harrod contract, I think,
would pay $40 million to OG.
Not every organization's competent.
Let me add, I think even Detroit, I think they'd have gave maybe 32, 33. They gave Tobias 25. Yeah, that does sound a little crazy, but
The Knicks were convinced that somebody would have given him 40 million. That's why they gave it to him. But that's why I'm kind of going back to that point. You traded 2 young players on long-term deals for a 1-year guy who you overpaid, and now you lose Hartenstein out of it. I still don't think that's good asset management. I don't even think I would have done the RJIQ deal, even looking back at it. But, it's going to be very interesting because this is the core they locked into. This is it. And Cat's one of those weird players. When you trade a lot for him, you're probably not going to trade for nearly as much if you wanted to deal him again. And I think that goes the same for Bridges. I think that goes the same for OG. So the most asset literate thing you could do is just have them on the team and see if it works out. But we've seen it against the best teams in the league. They're really good, but there's just a different class of high-end talent and teams with just they can exploit the Knicks if you have superior size and length.